So I read the book Into Thin Air that was written by Jon Krakauer. It was a nonfiction, true story book written about the events that happened on Mount Everest in 1996. It was about the tragedy of the expedition where 8 people died. It was one of the most tragic events that ever happened on Mount Everest. A brief explanation of the story, the plot of the story. So Jon Krakauer is the author of the book. Worked for Outside Magazine, and they wanted him to do an article about Everest, and he is an avid climber, climbed many peaks and summits in his past, so he thought this job would be perfect. After getting it, he realized he really wanted to do more than just go to base camp, so he said, why not climb all the way to the top? So he had Outside Magazine pay for him to get one of the best tour guides, Rob Hall, and who was accompanied by Andy Harris for this expedition, to take him up to the top of Mount Everest. Throughout the book, he kind of explained a lot of history and scientific things behind the climb. The climb was not just with that group, but there was 2 groups, so Rob Hall and Mike Groom were the 2 different head guides of the 2 different groups. Along the way up, they saw one death, not even all the way up, of somebody who had died from altitude sickness. I can't recall if this was in their group or another group, but once they reached the summit, that's when a lot of problems started happening. Rob Hall set a strict turnaround time for his group that was between 1 and 2 p.m. because of a storm that was coming in, but Mike Groom didn't believe in turnaround times. So there was a huge group of people that were still making their descent when the storm hit because they hadn't turned around by the correct time, and they got stuck in the storm. Some people made it back down to base camp 4, but they tried to go out and rescue them, and several of them died trying to rescue them. There was one male, however, who was trapped but somehow survived, but his entire face was covered in frostbite, and ended up losing his nose, which then went through a process to get it replaced, but that's another story. Jon Krakauer survived miraculously, but afterwards he wrote his article for the Outside Magazine, but felt it didn't bring enough closure, and there was too much to write about, so he decided to write Into Thin Air. When I went into reading this book, I was expecting a really kind of like action-packed book. Now, I had seen the movie previously, so that probably might have affected my interpretation of what I thought the book would be. But after starting to read the book, I realized very soon that it was not what I had expected, because in chapter 2, Jon Krakauer went very in-depth into the whole history of the mountain and explained very controversial ideas of paid tour guides. I thought this was really interesting because it gave an explanation of why he was writing the article, why he made the trip, a lot of whys to this book. He did go a little off topic sometimes, like very far, so it made it a little hard to follow, but I still like the idea of him explaining everything. Later on, you see in chapter 7 and 8, he explains why there's base camps. There's 4 base camps total throughout the ascent of Everest, and it's to deal with altitude sickness, to let your body adjust. He explains several different sicknesses that you can get, some deathly, some not, but he gives a lot of explanation to everything, and I really like that about the book. I wasn't expecting that. You can definitely tell he's a journalist when he goes into writing this book because of the stylistic approach he takes with the whole explanation to everything, giving facts and evidence to support all of his claims throughout. He was also an avid climber, so I feel like that also affected his opinions towards things. He knew a lot more than the average Joe would, and he's kind of a thrill seeker. He likes things like this, so that's why he felt the need to go on this trip and led to writing this book. Some of the chapters I found were a little bit more boring than others, and you had to kind of push through them, but then there was more others that were very adventure and thrill-like when they were climbing the mountain, especially in the descent when the storm hit, so that made the book very intriguing. There's a lot of contrast throughout the book, which I liked. It kind of kept you guessing what was going to happen next, even though sometimes the next page might bring some boring lecture about the history, but it was interesting to learn about. Throughout the book, you can see his primary purpose for writing this book wasn't to let everybody know that he's some awesome person who survived this awful tragedy. It was quite opposite. He wanted to get it out of his system. You could tell that he, like, in the post author's notes and in interviews, he very much did not like this experience. He wanted to get it off his chest. He felt there was more than he could fit in the article, in the magazine. He needed to get the whole story out there, and he said this trip was one of the biggest mistakes of his life. If he could, he would go back and undo it all, and he just did not like it. He suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder for years after the event and hated the fact that he actually went on this. After reading this book, I did enjoy it. I would recommend it, but only to certain audiences of people. It's not for everybody. It's not for people who want something very intriguing and interesting. It's somebody who wants to learn why things happen and how things happen and like the history behind things. There were some action parts of it, but the majority of the book was a very good history lesson, I would say. Kind of explained the reason for the trip, explained a lot of the history behind controversial ideas of Everest, and it was a very interesting book. I hadn't read one like it before, so I would recommend this for somebody who's looking for a bit of an explanation to an action type story.